Keeanga, you're in Philadelphia. Your book, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership, was a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for History. Congratulations. But I want to ask you about the historic victory in Philadelphia among housing activists after city officials agreed Friday to hand over 50 vacant homes to a community land trust following months of organizing by unhoused people, including protests, encampments, and taking over vacant homes. 50 mothers and children who've been occupying 15 vacant city-owned houses will also be permitted to stay as part of the deal. Philadelphia Housing Action, the group behind the Direct Action campaign, will set up the Community Land Trust. On Monday, we reached community organizer Jen Bennett at the Camp Teddy encampment and asked her to describe the significance of the victory.
Not just is it like a win for us, and not just is it a win even for the people in the encampments who will be able to move into homes, but this is also like 50 units that would have been sold to developers and used to speed up the process of gentrification in our neighborhoods. We're going to be able to like house people from the encampment if everything goes through right. And also we'll be stopping these units from being sold off to the private market and potentially becoming like luxury condos or student housing in our neighborhoods. If this works out, then that could be a good place to go and say like that instead of allowing housing authorities to like sell units and make money off of them after they intentionally neglected them until they were too much for them to deal with, then allow community groups to take on those units and rehab them and use them for what their original use was, which is to house people in need.
So that's housing organizer Jen Bennett. If you can talk about the significance of this victory and just in the bigger picture, we're talking about tens of millions of Americans face eviction. This is a key area that you focus on, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor.
Sure. I think this is tremendously significant. Not only is this a vindication of a strategy that was focused on direct action. People occupied, Tony sections of downtown Philadelphia. They refused to move. They acted in solidarity with each other. There are so many times over the last 2 months when the city threatened to shut down the camps, when the city threatened legal action against the organizers. And throughout that, people stood tall. They did not cave into the pressure, and they essentially called the city's bluff. And the city was reluctant to actually move in on the camp because Philadelphia has been a site of very large demonstrative protest around police brutality. There's a well-organized legal protection as well as activist networks in the city that I think created some pause and reluctance on the part of city officials. But I think even beyond its impact in Philadelphia, which I think is tremendous, there's a bigger lesson to be drawn here because this dynamic exists all over the country where you have both empty housing and houseless people, a completely irrational expression of what American capitalism means. But even more perniciously, you have public housing authorities. Every city has one, which is either sitting on properties that they should be distributing to people in need of housing, but they are sitting on properties waiting for the right price point to flip those properties for profit. And that is unconscionable for public housing authorities to be engaged in that kind of predatory, gentrifying behavior. And so what has happened here in Philadelphia is creating a model for what all tenant organizing and activist groups should be taking up, which is occupy the space, occupy the properties, and put pressure, political pressure, on public housing authorities to do their job and house people who are unhoused. It is not that complicated. We shouldn't be having empty housing and people without homes in the midst of a pandemic At no time should we be having it, but we certainly should not be experiencing this in the midst of a pandemic. And I think that this is a model, a strategic model, and a tactic that should be generalized by housing groups across the country. Now is the time, I think, to move on this, because the emergency of housing insecurity is at its most acute point. But also, there's a greater connection being made between housing as healthcare, housing as a right, that has been demonstrated by the CDC's own moratorium against evictions, which really demonstrate that housing is an issue of healthcare as well as an issue of shelter.
Keeanga-Yamahtta, we want to thank you so much for being with us. New Yorker writer, author of Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership, 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, assistant professor of African American Studies at Princeton University.